The morning Ethan Walker bought the rusted Ferry for $1, three executives laughed before the ink on the contract had dried. Not loudly. That would have been unprofessional. They laughed the way people laugh when they believe the world has just confirmed their intelligence. When a poor man in a faded harbor jacket has agreed to carry away a problem. They were too important to touch. Ethan heard them. He folded the contract once, placed it inside the breast pocket of his old canvas coat, and looked past them toward the dead vessel sitting at the edge of Pier 14. The ferry leaned slightly against the black water of Baltimore Harbor, its white paint peeled away in strips, its windows clouded by salt, its name barely visible beneath 20 years of rust and gull droppings. The harbor light, a dead boat, a useless boat, a legal liability with a leaking hull, according to the people who had just sold it. But Ethan Walker did not look at the ferry the way they did. He looked at the waterline. He looked at the angle of the bow. He looked at the welded seams beneath the corrosion. And then, for one brief second, his hand closed around the brass pocket watch in his coat, the one his father had carried through 34 years of shipyard shifts. That was the moment the laughter stopped mattering. 6 months later, the same executive stood behind a security rope outside the Baltimore Maritime Auction House, watching television crews film the harbor light under floodlights, while a crowd of investors, historians, engineers, and reporters waited to hear how a man they had dismissed as a broke dock mechanic had turned their $1 mistake into a company valued at more than $3 million. But the real story did not begin with money. It began with a sound Ethan heard inside the hull, a sound everyone else had missed. For most of his life, Ethan Walker had known the language of metal, not the poetic version people use when they describe ships as beautiful machines, but the practical language, the one carried through vibration, fatigue, rivet strain, weld discoloration, bilge odor, and the small betrayals of old steel under pressure. His father, Daniel Walker, had worked at Sparrow's Point before the old shipyards hollowed out and became memories. Men spoke about over bad coffee. Daniel had been the kind of man who could stand beside a diesel engine, close his eyes, and tell you which cylinder was misfiring before the gauge confirmed it. He taught Ethan the same way some fathers teach sons how to throw a baseball, slowly, without applause, with patience that looked like silence from a distance. When Ethan was 9, Daniel began taking him to the yards on Saturday mornings. The boy carried a dented blue lunchbox with 2 peanut butter sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and sat on overturned crates while men in welding masks moved like shadows behind curtains of sparks. By 12, Ethan could identify a bad bearing by sound. By 16, he could read hull stress the way other boys read comic books. By 23, he had graduated from the University of Maryland with a degree in naval architecture and marine engineering, carrying student debt, cracked work boots, and a strange kind of humility that made him almost invisible in rooms filled with louder people. He spent the next 11 years working for Chesapeake Marine Systems, a respected firm that inspected and restored commercial vessels along the mid-Atlantic coast. Ethan was not charismatic. He did not dominate meetings. He had a habit of pausing before answering questions, not because he was unsure, but because he disliked wasting words on half-formed thoughts. Managers sometimes mistook that for hesitation. Older mechanics did not. They watched him once, saw how he moved around a vessel, how he touched steel only after studying it, how he listened before opening a panel, and they gave him the rarest kind of professional respect. They stopped explaining obvious things. Then Chesapeake Marine Systems was acquired by a national infrastructure group out of New York. The new leadership called it consolidation. The employees called it something else in parking lots, behind tool sheds, near vending machines that ate dollar bills. 14 positions were eliminated in 1 week. Ethan's email arrived at 6:43 on a Thursday evening, while he was sitting at the kitchen table in his small apartment in Dundalk, trying to repair the clasp on his daughter's backpack. His daughter, Lily, was asleep in the next room with a library book open on her chest. The apartment smelled faintly of canned soup and laundry detergent. Ethan read the email twice. He set the phone face down beside a chipped mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. Then he finished fixing the backpack. No dramatic collapse, no angry phone call, no speech about loyalty. Just a man at a kitchen table pressing a bent zipper pull back into shape because his daughter needed the backpack in the morning. For 3 months after that, Ethan took whatever work came. Marine surveys for small insurers, emergency pump repairs. A cracked transom on a crab boat owned by a man who paid him in cash and 2 sacks of oysters. A late-night call from a marina owner whose fuel dock had a pressure issue. He kept a spreadsheet in an old notebook because his laptop battery died if unplugged for more than 6 minutes. Rent, groceries, Lily's school lunch account, gas, medication for his mother, who lived 40 minutes away and still refused to admit her knees were failing. He did not have savings in any impressive sense. He had $9,740 in a credit union account, a truck with 214,000 miles, and a father's brass pocket watch that no longer kept perfect time but still opened with a clean mechanical click. Across the harbor, Marin Whitcomb had problems of a different kind. At 42, Marin was the CEO of Whitcomb Urban Development, a family firm she had inherited from her uncle and transformed into one of the most aggressive waterfront redevelopment companies in Maryland. Her public image was polished, dark suits, quiet jewelry, precise language. She gave interviews about revitalizing neglected industrial areas and bringing new economic energy to old spaces. She believed in efficiency with a devotion that bordered on faith. Under her leadership, Whitcomb Urban had acquired 3 aging piers and 2 adjacent warehouses along the Middle Branch waterfront, with plans for a luxury mixed-use district. Apartments, retail, restaurants, event space, and a marina filled with vessels owned by people who used words like escape when describing second homes. On the western edge of the property sat Pier 14. At the end of Pier 14 sat the Harbor Light. The ferry had been built in 1948, operated for decades as a commuter and service vessel, then converted into a private excursional boat sometime in the late 70s before being abandoned after a bankruptcy dispute in the early 2000s. Since then, it had sat half-forgotten in the water, tied to rotting bollards, collecting rain, birds, and legal complications. Whitcomb Urban did not want it. The inspection report called it structurally compromised. The environmental consultant warned of possible remediation costs. The project manager estimated towing, disposal, permitting, and hazardous material handling could exceed $70,000. Marin circled that number in red during a Monday morning meeting and wrote beside it, "Remove liability." Her legal counsel suggested offering the vessel for nominal sale with a full waiver. Her project director, Bryce Harlan, joked that maybe some dock rat with a fantasy would take it. Marin did not laugh. She rarely laughed in meetings. But she approved the idea in less than a minute. "List it privately," she said. "No publicity, no delay. I want it gone before the pier engineering team starts staging equipment." The notice reached Ethan through a man named Roy Delgado. Roy had once worked with Ethan at Chesapeake Marine and now ran a small diesel repair shop behind a chain-link fence near Canton. He called Ethan on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, while Ethan was under a fishing charter boat trying to remove a seized coupling. "You still looking for something stupid enough to change your life?" Roy asked. Ethan shifted the phone between his shoulder and ear. "That depends how expensive stupid is. $1. Ethan stopped turning the wrench. Roy told him about the ferry. He had heard about it from a tow operator, who had heard about it from someone at the permitting office. The vessel was old, ugly, probably full of problems, and tied to a redevelopment site controlled by people who wanted it gone fast. Ethan wrote the name on the back of a fuel receipt. Harbor Light. He drove there the next morning before sunrise. The harbor was gray, quiet, and cold. A thin fog moved low over the water, softening the cranes and warehouse roofs until they looked unfinished. Traffic hummed somewhere behind him, distant and indifferent. Seagulls stood in a line along a rusted railing, as if waiting for a meeting to begin. Ethan parked his truck outside the locked gate and sat with both hands on the steering wheel. From the street, the ferry looked worse than Roy had described. Its upper deck railings were bent. The starboard side showed long streaks of rust bleeding down toward the waterline. One window had been broken and patched with plywood. A faded company logo from some forgotten dinner cruise business clung to the side like an old bruise. But Ethan did not leave. He lowered the window and listened. Wind moved through loose metal somewhere on the deck. A halyard tapped against a mast with a slow, hollow rhythm. Water slapped the hull in uneven intervals. Then he heard something else. Not loud, not dramatic. A dull responding note from inside the vessel when a small wave struck the port side. Most people would have heard only a dead boat creaking. Ethan heard compartmental separation. He heard an interior space that was still holding shape. He got out of the truck. The appointment was scheduled for 2 days later. Marin Whitcomb arrived with Bryce Harlan, a junior attorney named Simon Vale, and a contracted marine surveyor who looked annoyed to be standing in the cold. Marin wore a charcoal coat and black leather gloves. Her hair was pulled back, neat enough to look effortless only to people who did not understand effort. Ethan wore his harbor jacket, jeans darkened at the knees, and boots with salt dried into the seams. He had shaved that morning but missed a small patch beneath his jaw. Marin noticed. People like Marin noticed everything, or believed they did. "You're Mr. Walker?" she asked. "Yes, Mom." Her eyes moved briefly to his truck, then to the tool bag in his hand. "Are you representing a salvage company?" "No, a towing operator?" "No." Bryce glanced at Simon and smiled. Ethan looked toward the ferry. "I'd like to inspect her." Marin held his gaze for a moment, as if deciding whether the morning had already taken too much time. "You understand the vessel is being sold as is," she said. "No warranties, no claims, no remediation responsibility retained by Whitcomb Urban. You remove it, insure it, or otherwise assume full liability." "I read the terms. The pier must be cleared within 90 days if our staging permit is approved." "I read that too." Bryce gave a soft laugh through his nose. The contracted surveyor unlocked the temporary access gate. They walked down the pier single file, the boards damp beneath them, water visible through gaps where old planks had warped. The harbor light rose ahead of them like a thing embarrassed to still be alive. Inside, the vessel smelled of mildew, oil residue, old varnished nests, and trapped rainwater. Marin stayed near the entrance. Bryce checked his phone. Simon carried a folder against his chest, as if paper could protect him from tetanus. Ethan moved slowly. He did not shine his flashlight everywhere at once. He let it settle: bulkheads, frames, deck beams, engine room hatch, water staining, rust patterns, fastener heads, old wiring conduit, access panels. The surveyor spoke in a bored tone. "Previous report found hull deterioration, unknown tank contents, electrical failure, possible asbestos insulation near the engine compartment, deck rot, and non-operational propulsion." Ethan nodded. He crouched near a seam in the lower passageway and ran 2 fingers across a line of corrosion. Marin watched him with thin patience. After 23 minutes, Ethan asked if he could see the engine room. The surveyor hesitated. "Ladder's not exactly friendly. I'll manage." Below deck, the air changed. It was colder, closer, more honest. Ethan descended with his flashlight held between his teeth for the last few rungs. His boots landed in shallow water with a soft splash. The engine room was cramped, blackened by age, and cluttered with shapes that meant nothing to people who had never worked in spaces where machines outlived owners. He swept the beam across the old diesel blocks, then stopped. A brass plate, half covered in grime. He wiped it with his sleeve, Fairbanks Morse. His breath slowed. Not because the engine was valuable by itself, because of where it was mounted, because of the foundation beneath it, because the alignment marks had not shifted. He moved deeper into the compartment and saw the second anomaly. A welded steel locker built into the aft bulkhead. Not original, not noted in the report. Heavy hinges, no visible label. A padlock so corroded it looked like a fossil. Ethan did not touch it. He only looked. When he climbed back up, Bryce was telling Marin about a restaurant group interested in the waterfront retail parcels. Ethan wiped his on a rag. "I'll take it." Bryce actually blinked. Marin's expression did not change. "For $1? Yes. You haven't asked for concessions." "No. You haven't requested additional survey access. I saw what I needed to see." Bryce's smile returned. "That's confidence." Ethan looked at him. "No, it's a decision." The paperwork was signed on the hood of Simon Vale's car because no one wanted to walk back to the office trailer. The pen skipped once in the cold. Ethan signed anyway. Marin signed after him. Bryce took a photo of the contract for the file and said, not quite quietly enough, "Well, that solves the ugly boat problem." Ethan placed his copy in his coat. The brass pocket watch pressed against the paper. He did not look back at them until he reached the gate. Then he turned once toward the ferry. Not triumphantly, not dramatically. Just long enough to confirm that the harbor light was still there. Waiting. The first night Ethan owned the ferry, he did not sleep. Lily had a spelling test the next morning, so he sat with her at the kitchen table while she wrote words in pencil on lined paper. Harbor, believe. Wait, repair. She misspelled believe twice. He made toast, because there was no dinner left except half a container of rice and a bruised apple. His mother called at 8:17 to ask whether he had remembered to mail her insurance form. He had not. He told her he would. After Lily went to bed, Ethan opened his notebook. He wrote 3 columns: immediate hazards, unknown assets, 90-day deadline. Under unknown assets, he wrote engine blocks. Aft locker, hull note. He sat there for a long time. The refrigerator clicked on. A police siren moved somewhere far down Eastern Avenue. The pocket watch lay open beside the notebook, its second and twitching unevenly, losing time the way old things do when no one has the heart to throw them away. At 5:10 the next morning, Ethan was back at Pier 14. He brought Roy. Roy was 58, broad-shouldered and built like a man assembled from stubbornness and diesel smoke. He wore a black knit cap pulled low and carried 2 thermoses of coffee, one of which he handed to Ethan without comment. They boarded the ferry in silence. Roy took one look around the lower deck and said, "You paid too much." Ethan handed him the flashlight. "Engine room." Roy grunted and followed. Below deck, Roy's sarcasm thinned. He studied the engine mounts, the shaft line, the dry sections of the bilge, the older welds and newer modifications. Then he saw the aft locker. "What's that?" "Not on the report." Roy stepped closer. "That's not ferry equipment." "No, you open it?" "Not yet." Roy looked at him. "You bought a dead ferry because of a mystery box?" "I bought it because the hull is better than they think." "And the mystery box?" "That didn't hurt." They spent the next 6 hours documenting the vessel. Not restoring, not dreaming, documenting. Ethan photographed every structural frame. Roy tagged mechanical components with masking tape and black marker. They found 3 pumps, 2 of them dead, 1 possibly recoverable. They found old navigation equipment from the 1980s, a sealed chart cabinet, and a stack of mildewed passenger benches bolted to the upper deck. At noon, rain began to fall. Cold rain, persistent rain, the kind that turns harbor air metallic. Ethan was in the lower compartment when Roy called his name. There was no alarm in Roy's voice. That made Ethan move faster. Roy stood near a forward storage room, shining the light through a narrow gap behind a collapsed panel. Behind it was a second compartment, small, sealed, hidden behind a false wall. Ethan crouched and looked. Inside, he saw wooden crates. Archival crates, stamped with faded black letters. Baltimore Transit Authority, 1949. Moot Survey. Ethan did not speak. Roy scratched his beard. "Now, I'm not saying this is normal." "No, but I am saying," Roy continued, "that your $1 boat is starting to annoy me." They did not open the crates immediately. Moisture, age, and careless handling could destroy paper faster than fire. Ethan called a former client, Dr. Helen Mercer, a maritime historian who had once hired him to assess an old patrol boat used in a museum exhibit. Helen arrived that evening wearing rain boots, a navy coat, and the expression of a woman who had missed dinner willingly. She brought gloves, acid-free folders, a portable scanner, and a warning. "If this is mold-damaged nonsense, I'm going to be very irritated with you." "It might be nonsense." Helen looked around the hidden compartment. "No, it isn't." The first crate contained route maps, original surveys for post-war ferry lines, industrial docks, submerged utility corridors, and obsolete rail-to-quarter transfer points across Baltimore Harbor. The second contained photographs, pier construction, workers, cargo operations. A ceremony from 1951 showing city officials standing aboard the harbor light with shovels and ribbon. The third crate changed everything. Inside was a rolled engineering plan sealed in waxed cloth. Helen unrolled the edge only far enough to read the title block. Her face became very still. "Ethan," he looked up. "This is an original infrastructure alignment plan for the South Harbor Tunnel proposal." Roy frowned. "The what?" Helen did not answer him immediately. She kept looking at the paper like it might disappear if she moved too quickly. In the late 40s, the city studied several underground utility and freight alignments beneath this section of the harbor. Most were abandoned before construction. The records were thought to be incomplete. Ethan looked toward the bulkhead. "Why would they be on the ferry?" "Because vessels like this were used as mobile survey platforms before permanent offices were built. Sometimes documents stayed where the engineers used them." Roy pointed at the crates. "You're telling me this junk might matter?" Helen looked at him. "I'm telling you these records might identify infrastructure nobody has accurately mapped in 70 years. The rain intensified above them. For a moment, all 3 stood listening to water strike the deck. Then Ethan heard it again, that dull internal note, the one from the first morning. Only now it came with a faint metallic knock beneath the aft compartment. Not from the ferry, from below it. The next week became a quiet war against time. Whitcomb Urban Staging Permit moved faster than expected. Marin's team notified Ethan by certified letter that Pier 14 would need to be cleared in 68 days, not 90, pending final approval. Ethan had no facility large enough to house the ferry, no investors, no crew beyond Roy, Helen, and 2 part-time marine workers he paid in cash from money he could not spare. He rented equipment by the day because weekly rates were impossible. He ate gas station sandwiches and drank coffee that tasted like burnt cardboard. At night, he came home with rust in the lines of his hands. Lily began leaving drawings on the kitchen table for him. One showed a boat with yellow windows and a stick figure standing proudly on top. She labeled it, Dad's Ship. Ethan folded it carefully and placed it inside his notebook. By the 3rd week, they had opened the aft locker. Inside were 5 waterproof metal cases, not treasure in the childish sense. No gold bars, no stolen diamonds. Something stranger. Shipyard records, patent drawings. Correspondence between a small Baltimore marine engineering firm and the U.S. Maritime Commission. And one prototype assembly, wrapped in oiled canvas, compact and heavy, with machined brass and steel components unlike anything Roy had expected to find. Roy held it under the work light and whispered, "I haven't seen machining like this in 30 years." Helen found the answer 2 folders later. The device was part of an experimental fuel flow stabilizer designed for marine diesel engines during the early Cold War era, intended to reduce vibration and improve efficiency in small commercial vessels. The company that developed it had vanished after its founder died suddenly in 1952. The patent had expired long ago. But the prototype, the drawings, the test logs, and the performance notes were intact. Ethan spent 2 nights reading them, not as a historian, as an engineer. On the 3rd night, at 2:14 in the morning, he wrote 1 sentence in his notebook. They were solving a problem we still have. Modern small marine operators spent fortunes on fuel inefficiency, vibration damage, and maintenance downtime. The old prototype was not commercially usable as is, but the principle behind it was elegant, too elegant to ignore. Ethan called a former classmate named Priya Nance, who now worked as a mechanical systems consultant in Norfolk. She answered on the 4th ring. "It's 2 in the morning. I know. Someone better be sinking." "Not exactly." He sent her photos. There was silence on the line for nearly a minute. Then Priya said, "Where did you get this?" "A ferry." "I'm too tired for that answer. It's the true one." By dawn, Priya had agreed to review the drawings. By the following evening, she had sent back a 12-page technical assessment with 1 line highlighted near the top. Concept appears mechanically valid, historically significant, and potentially adaptable using modern materials and digital control. Ethan printed the page at a library. Because his printer at home had no ink, he carried it folded in his coat pocket beside the contract and the watch. Meanwhile, Maren Whitcomb began hearing things, at first only fragments. A historian seen entering the ferry. A consultant from Norfolk visiting the site. A small crew working late under temporary lights. Bryce dismissed it. "Probably stripping copper," he said. Maren looked through the conference room window toward the harbor. "Copper doesn't require a historian." Bryce had no answer for that. 2 days later, Charlotte Vale, a business reporter for Mid-Atlantic Ledger, called Whitcomb Urban's communications office asking for comment on the harbor light. Maren read the email twice. Then she called Bryce into her office. "What exactly did we sell? A derelict vessel. What was inside it?" Bryce shifted his weight. "The survey didn't include contents inventory beyond visible hazards." "That wasn't my question." He said nothing. Maren's jaw tightened, not with panic yet, but with the early stage of a feeling she disliked, uncertainty. The first public crack came from Helen. She gave a short interview to a local preservation blog about forgotten harbor infrastructure and mentioned, carefully, that significant archival material had been recovered from a privately acquired vessel. She did not name Ethan. She did not name Whitcomb. But Baltimore was not as large as people thought when the right people started whispering. Within days, the harbor light had visitors at the gate. Curious marina workers, old shipyard retirees, a man from the Historical Society, a YouTuber who filmed from the sidewalk until Roy told him to point the camera somewhere else. Ethan hated the attention. Roy hated it more efficiently. Then the real crisis came. A storm hit Baltimore on a Friday night, not historic. Not the kind that makes national news. Just hard wind, heavy rain, and a tide high enough to punish neglected things. At 11:38 p.m., Ethan received a call from one of the part-time workers. "Water's coming in faster than the pump can keep up." Ethan was already reaching for his boots. Lily stood in her bedroom doorway, holding a stuffed rabbit by one ear. "Dad? I have to go check the boat. Is it sinking?" He paused. "Children know when adults lie badly. Not if I get there fast. He called his mother to come over. She complained for 30 seconds, then said she was putting on shoes. At the pier, the rain hit sideways. The harbor light strained against its lines. Temporary lights swung in the wind, turning the deck into a sequence of shadows. Roy was already there, soaked through, shouting over the storm, while a portable pump coughed and failed, and coughed again. The leak was worse than expected. A compromised plate near the portside lower hull had opened under stress. Ethan climbed down into the compartment with water rising around his calves. Roy followed with a patch kit. The next 40 minutes became the kind of work no camera can make glamorous. Cold water, numb hands. Bolts dropped and found by touch. A flashlight dying, Roy swearing at a clamp. Ethan pressing his shoulder against a temporary plate while Roy tightened from the opposite side. At one point, the ferry shifted hard enough that Ethan's head struck a frame. He saw white for half a second. Then he went back to holding pressure. Above them, thunder moved across the harbor. Below them, the harbor light groaned, but the patch held. At 1:06 a.m., the pump caught up. At 1:42, the water level began to drop. Roy sat down on the ladder with rain running off his nose and said, "I'm getting too old for heroic stupidity." Ethan leaned against the bulkhead, breathing hard. "It's not heroic." No, it's just ours now." Roy looked at him then, not at the engineer, not at the broke man who had bought a ferry. At the boy who had learned ships from his father and still believed old things deserved to be understood before being condemned. Roy nodded once. That was all. The storm did more than threaten the ferry. It exposed what lay beneath it. The next morning, debris shifted near the pier, and Ethan saw a line of old pilings partly hidden under the water. Their spacing matched one of the 1949 infrastructure drawings. Helen came with sonar equipment borrowed from a university contact. Priya drove up from Norfolk. Together, they confirmed that beneath Pier 14 was a forgotten service corridor entrance, sealed decades earlier, connected to the abandoned tunnel alignment shown in the harbor light plans. This was not merely historically interesting. It was commercially explosive. Whitcomb Urban's redevelopment plan required deep foundation work across the pier. If unrecorded infrastructure existed beneath the site, constructions would require additional review, redesign, and likely months of delay. But for Ethan, the discovery meant something else. The corridor could provide legal access to an old, dry utility platform beneath an adjacent warehouse lot not yet owned by Whitcomb. A lot currently listed for $180,000 because everyone assumed it was contaminated dead space. Ethan did not sleep that night. By morning, he had spoken to a small credit union, Helen's preservation contact, and Priya's consulting firm. By the end of the week, he had formed Harbor Light Marine Works, LLC. He purchased an option on the adjacent warehouse lot using borrowed money, personal risk, and a private note from a retired shipyard supervisor named Amos Reed, who had known Ethan's father. Amos met Ethan in a diner at 6 a.m. He slid the cashier's check across the table beside a plate of eggs he barely touched. "Your father once fixed a tug engine for me in January with a fever," Amos said. "Wouldn't take full pay because he said the repair didn't take as long as he expected." Ethan stared at the check. "I can't guarantee this. I'm not asking you to." "Then why?" Amos wiped his mouth with a paper napkin. "Because Daniel Walker raised a man who knows the difference between risk and foolishness." Ethan folded the check into his notebook. His hands were not steady. The next phase moved fast. Too fast for comfort. Priya helped adapt the old fuel flow stabilizer concept into a modern prototype using updated materials, sensors, and a compact control module. Roy built the test rig in a rented warehouse with a cracked concrete floor and fluorescent lights that flickered when the compressor started. Helen worked with preservation authorities to authenticate the recovered documents. Ethan negotiated with the city over the historical corridor. Whitcomb Urban filed a legal inquiry, claiming possible failure to disclose site-related materials connected to their former property. Simon Vale sent Ethan a letter written in the polished language of people who hope intimidation can pass for law. Ethan read it while standing beside Lily's school bus stop. The morning was bright and cold. Lily was wearing mismatched gloves. "Is that bad?" she asked. "It's a letter. From bad people?" He folded it. "From worried people." That afternoon, Marin requested a meeting. Ethan agreed, because refusing would waste more time than attending. They met in a glass conference room overlooking the harbor. Marin sat at the head of the table. Bryce sat to her right. Simon opened a legal pad he probably did not need. Ethan came alone. His jacket was clean but old. There was a healing cut above his eyebrow from the storm night. He placed his notebook on the table but did not open it. Marin began carefully. Mr. Walker, it appears the vessel contained materials that may have relevance to our redevelopment site. Yes, those materials were not disclosed at sale. I didn't know they existed when I signed, but they were physically located on an asset sold by Whitcomb Urban. The contract transferred the vessel and all contents. Simon looked up. That may be subject to interpretation. Ethan turned to him. It isn't. Bryce leaned back. Come on. You bought a wreck for $1 and found paperwork. Nobody's trying to take your little project. Ethan looked at Bryce long enough for the room to notice the silence. Then he said, don't call it little because you failed to look. Marin's eyes moved to Bryce. For once, he did not smile. Ethan opened his notebook and removed a copy of the contract, then a copy of the survey report, then photographs from the after purchase. He placed them on the table in order. No speech, no anger, just evidence. The vessel was offered as is, Ethan said. No contents exclusion, no reserved documents, no inventory attachment, no access restriction after transfer. Your team classified the ferry as disposal liability. I accepted liability. That included the risk. It also included the contents. Marin read the contract again. She already knew what it said. But knowing a thing privately and having it placed in front of you by someone you underestimated are different experiences. What do you want? She asked. Ethan closed the notebook. Nothing from you. That seems unlikely. I want time to move the vessel without interference. I want your legal team to stop implying claims it can't support. And I want your construction people to avoid disturbing the submerged corridor until the city completes documentation. Bryce laughed once. You want to delay a 9-figure project? Ethan looked at him. No, your due diligence did that. The meeting ended without a handshake. But Marin did not let Bryce speak on the elevator ride down. That mattered. 2 months after the $1 sale, the prototype ran for the first time. It was not pretty. The test engine shook so hard that a wrench walked off the edge of the bench and hit the floor. A sensor failed. The control module overheated. Roy declared the whole thing possessed. Priya adjusted the fuel mapping. Ethan changed the mount geometry. They ran it again. Still rough. Again. Better. Again. The vibration curve dropped. Not by a miracle, by 12%, then 18%, then 23% under a specific load condition. Roy stood behind the test rig with his arms folded, watching the numbers stabilize on Priya's laptop. I hate when old ghosts are right, he said. Priya smiled without looking away from the screen. They weren't ghosts, they were engineers with bad funding. Ethan did not smile yet. He waited for repeatability. 3 more tests, same pattern. The old concept worked, not perfectly. Not commercially yet, but enough. Priya contacted a small marine technology investor she trusted. Helen introduced Ethan to a maritime museum director. Amos Reed called 2 retired shipyard men who still knew everyone worth knowing in Baltimore. Within 3 weeks, Harbor Light Marine Works had its first serious offer. A paid pilot program with a regional ferry operator looking to reduce maintenance costs on aging diesel vessels. The contract was worth $240,000. Ethan read the offer in his truck outside a grocery store. Lily sat beside him eating a soft pretzel from a paper bag. Is it good? She asked. He looked at the number again. Yes. How good? He handed her a napkin. New backpack good. She considered that. With the turtle pattern? With the turtle pattern. She nodded, satisfied by the only valuation that mattered to her. The public reveal happened before Ethan was ready. Charlotte Vale published the first article under the headline, The $1 Ferry That May Rewrite Baltimore's Harbor Map. It was careful, well-researched, and devastating. Not because it mocked Whitcomb Urban. It did not need to. It simply laid out the facts. A major developer sold a vessel as scrap. A laid-off marine engineer purchased it. The vessel contained lost historical infrastructure plans. Those plans revealed unmapped harbor structures beneath a redevelopment site. The same vessel held engineering prototypes now being adapted for modern marine efficiency. By noon, Ethan's phone would not stop ringing. By evening, 2 local news crews were outside the warehouse. By the next morning, Marin Whitcomb's board wanted answers. Marin did not blame the media. That would have been easy. She blamed the silence in her own process. The skipped inventory, the rushed disposal. The assumption that ugly meant worthless. The belief that liability and value could not occupy the same object. In a private board meeting, Bryce attempted to frame the issue as an unforeseeable anomaly. Marin let him speak for 4 minutes. Then she asked one question. Did anyone open the aft locker? Bryce stopped. No one answered. The question did not require an answer. Bryce resigned 2 weeks later, though the press release used softer language. The auction took place in September, not for the ferry itself. For the restored archival collection, the authenticated maritime artifacts, and a licensing demonstration tied to the fuel flow stabilizer adaptation. The harbor light, now stabilized and cleaned, was docked under temporary lights near the Baltimore Maritime Auction House as part of a public preservation event. People came because the story had become irresistible. Old shipyard workers came wearing jackets from companies that no longer existed. Young engineers came with notebooks. Investors came pretending they cared about history. Reporters came because reversal stories always photograph well. Marin came because not coming would look worse. Ethan wore a dark suit that did not fit perfectly across the shoulders. Roy wore the same knit cap because he claimed auctions did not control his head temperature. Priya stood near the display model with a tablet full of test data. Helen hovered protectively near the archival cases like a museum guard with a PhD. Lily sat in the front row with Ethan's mother. She had the turtle backpack beside her chair. The main licensing presentation began at 7:30. Priya spoke first, clean and precise. Helen spoke next, giving the historical context. Then Ethan was asked to speak. He hated that part. He walked to the microphone and looked out at the room. For a second, he saw too many faces. Then he saw Lily, then Roy, then the ferry beyond the glass lit against the dark harbor. He placed his father's brass watch on the podium. Not for drama, because his hand needed something familiar nearby. I don't have a long speech, he said. The room quieted. The harbor light was called useless because people looked at the surface and saw cost. That wasn't irrational. Old vessels are expensive. Rust is real. Liability is real. But cost is not the same as value. And condition is not the same as possibility. He paused. A camera clicked. My father used to say steel tells the truth, but only if you listen before you decide. That's all we did. He stepped back. The applause did not explode. It rose slowly. That was better. The pilot licensing package closed that night with commitments totaling $4 million across development funding, historical acquisition rights, and early commercial trials. The adjacent warehouse lot Ethan had optioned was reappraised after the corridor discovery and city preservation designation. Its value more than tripled. Harbor Light Marine Works secured a long-term lease to convert the warehouse into a marine restoration and efficiency lab. Roy received equity. Priya became chief systems engineer. Helen joined the advisory board. Amos Reed refused any public recognition, but accepted a chair in the new workshop with his name engraved on a brass plate, though he complained the plate was too shiny. Near the end of the evening, Marin approached Ethan outside on the pier. The harbor was dark, except for reflections moving across the water. For a while, neither of them spoke. The harbor light rested between them, no longer dead, not exactly reborn, but held in that rare middle state where something old has been granted another chapter. Marin wore a navy coat this time. No entourage, no Bryce, no attorney. I misread it, she said. Ethan looked at the ferry. Yes, she accepted the answer. A gull cried somewhere above the roofline of the auction house. I thought I was removing a problem. You were. That made her look at him. He continued. You just didn't check whether the problem contained anything worth saving. Marin's face changed slightly, not wounded, not offended, struck perhaps by the fairness of it. I built my company by seeing value where other people saw decay, she said. Ethan nodded. Then you know how expensive it is when you stop doing that. For the first time since he had met her, Marin had no immediate response. After a moment, she extended her hand. He shook it. There was no forgiveness scene, no sudden friendship, no speech that made everything clean. Just two people standing beside dark water, both aware that one of them had paid $1 for what the other had failed to see. Later that night, after the reporters left and the lights began shutting down, Ethan walked alone through the harbor light. The vessel no longer smelled abandoned. It smelled of fresh ventilation, cleaned wood, machine oil, and harbor air. He passed the passenger benches, the engine room ladder, the hidden compartment where Helen had first opened the crates. In the lower deck, he stopped beside the aft locker. The empty locker. He touched the steel door. For a moment, he was 9 years old again. Sitting on a crate at Sparrow's Point, watching his father listen to an engine, as if the machine were speaking privately to him. Ethan took out the brass pocket watch. It was still losing time. He opened the back cover with his thumbnail. Inside, where his father had once scratched his initials, Ethan had added a small piece of paper folded twice. Lily's drawing, Dad's ship. He smiled then, not for the cameras, not for the money, not for Marin Whitcomb or the executives who had laughed. He smiled because, somewhere between rust and rain, between a storm patch and a hidden crate, between fear and a $1 contract, he had built something his daughter could point to and understand. Not completely, not yet, but one day. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the warehouse before anyone else. The city was still waking up. Trucks moved along the waterfront. A delivery driver cursed at a locked gate. Coffee steamed from a paper cup on the workbench. He stood in the unfinished lab and listened. A compressor clicked on in the back. Water moved against the pier. The harbor light creaked softly outside, not like a dead vessel, but like an old worker stretching before another shift. Ethan opened his notebook and wrote beneath the first entry, $1 is what they charged me to take the problem away. 6 months is what it took to learn what the problem was protecting. Then he closed the notebook, picked up a wrench and went to work. Because the world loves the moment of discovery. But Ethan Walker had never trusted moments. He trusted what came after. The cold mornings, the stripped bolts, the unpaid invoices. The second test after the first one failed. The quiet people who stayed when there was no applause. The old things that still had something useful hidden inside them. And the difference between what something looks like and what it is. That difference had cost Marin Whitcomb $1. It had cost Ethan Walker 6 months of work, every dollar he had, a cut above his eye, several sleepless nights, and more fear than he ever admitted out loud. But by the end, it had given him a company, a future, and a ferry that no longer sat at the edge of the harbor waiting to be removed. It waited to be understood.